Welcome, everybody. My name is Dimitri Vlachos. I'm the CMO over here at Spacelift, and I'm really excited to be here presenting to you at IaCConf 2025. And I'm here to talk about overcoming the speed control paradox. And this is really about exploring some really interesting findings from our recently released infrastructure automation research report. And let's dive right in. So I wanted to first really cover why do we do this research in the first place. And our goal here was really to bring some valuable insights to the community. You know, much like the IaCConf community, we really wanted to provide three main things. One, the ability to illuminate the current landscape of infrastructure automation. What are people doing? What are the business outcomes they're getting from that? What's the benefit they're receiving? And what are the key behaviors and processes they're automating to get that benefit? Two, we wanted to be able to deliver a roadmap for maturity and impact. So if you're a DevOps or a platform team organization, and you're trying to figure out where are we, what are the things we should be doing to get the most impact to our companies, we wanted to help deliver a roadmap that could help you, understand what are the good paths to go down. And then three, we wanted to provide really a measurable framework for progress so that you could understand, teams can understand where they are, and they can understand as later in time, evaluate and understand where they've progressed, both in behaviors and outcomes that they're delivering. So that was the real goal of this research. And in terms of who we surveyed, we really wanted to make this a broad survey. And we also wanted to look at not just practitioners in terms of hands-on, but also looking at from a decision maker, in purchase influencers. So mixing kind of both practitioners who have a heavy influence and many times are the decision makers, but blending that audience. And you can see here we have a pretty good distribution. We have over 400 people in this survey in various roles in terms of leadership and practitioners, and as well as a pretty good breakdown and covering of a lot of industries. So it's a really good broad survey that has a lot of a statistical merit to it, which is great. So I also wanted to give you just the high level before we dive into some other pieces of what separates leaders, what the current landscape looks like. I wanted to give you just a high level view of how we built this. Coming out of this research, we identified and created something called the Infrastructure Automation Leadership Index. And this is the idea of having that framework for measurement and having a way of looking at where are different stages, what are the different stages we see of companies, DevOps teams, platform teams in kind of their leadership their infrastructure automation stages. And so there's four real stages that emerged. And these stages are a mix of behaviors, processes, and the outcomes that are being experienced, because of those processes and behaviors. So there's experimenters, and these are usually teams that are beginning their path into infrastructure automation. They have a lot of manual processes still, and they're probably starting to automate and use infrastructure as code and other automations in isolated locations. So we see a lot of companies will start here. They might have different DevOps teams running Terraform or OpenTofu on their own laptops, right? They're starting to get used to it. They're seeing the benefit, and they're exploring ways of how can we centralize. That's kind of experimenter. Adopters where, hey, they've started to see some value, and adopters are usually looking more and more to centralize. They're starting to understand the need to process around how they're going to orchestrate their infrastructure as code or automation. And they're typically, they might be using a traditional software CI/CD. They might start to use an infrastructure orchestration platform, but they're starting to see ways of how do I glue all this together. And you can see that 42%. Most of the people that we surveyed are in this bucket of adopter. Optimizer, this is where we see people starting to make real progress towards streamlining how they deploy, and they're starting to bring governance into that mix, but there's still gaps in terms of security, compliance, and scalability and how they're running their infrastructure pipelines. And then finally, leaders, this is where they've deeply integrated not only the automation to deploy, but the automation to actually do long-term day 2 operations. They've integrated security both into the early parts of their pipelines with security scanning. They've brought policies in, governance, cost controls. They've really kind of taken a lot of different pieces and put it into their centralized automation. So these are, and there's 14% of the population we found in the leader category. So this hopefully sets the stage of these different stages we've seen and where people are in the Automation Leadership Index. And now what I want to do is spend some time digging into really exploring some of the key findings and what organizations can do based on these findings to improve their automation. So I wanted to kind of start with how do people think they're doing, because it was really interesting to go and have a framework where we can take a set of questions, which we'll get into later on, of what are the actual questions we took from the survey to really analyze and classify people and programs into those different buckets. But when you ask people, how do you think you're doing with automation, and comparing that versus what our model showed. And so what's interesting is most people think they're doing well, but they aren't doing as well as they think they are, which might not be shocking. But nonetheless, when we ask that question, 45% of respondents believe that they're excelling at infrastructure automation. But as you saw in the data we just broke down, only 14% are really in that leadership category. And so there's really a pretty big divide here between people think they're excelling, but when we look at the combination of the behaviors people are doing, the processes they're automating, and importantly, the benefits they're seeing in terms of measurable outcomes, only 14% are really excelling. So, when you dig into why is that, what's the real crux of where people believe they are versus where we see them from a model perspective and measurement perspective, it really comes down to what we call the speed control paradox. And this is where, at the core of the infrastructure automation challenge is this paradox. How can you go fast? How can you enable your developers to have fast deployment of infrastructure when they need it? How can you ensure at the same time that you're going fast and scaling, so not only can you deploy quickly, but more and more teams can deploy quickly in a repeatable way? How do you also have the security, compliance, reliability, and cost controls that go along with really high-performant teams and high-performing applications? Because remember, at the end of the day, this is all about how can companies continue to innovate, deploy applications quickly, adapt quickly, and satisfy their customers, right? So that's really, this is the speed control paradox, which we'll get into more about how do you balance that. That's really a key finding here of leaders are really good at that. So where do you think companies are focused, right? If you step back and say speed and control, these two key aspects of infrastructure automation, well, where do you think people are focused? And it's really this balance that's interesting. So leaders, right, are almost 3 times more likely to focus on control than they are, 2 more times. They're twice as likely almost to focus on control than they are speed. Whereas earlier stage programs, it's flipped, right? They're 71% focused on speed, 29% focused on control. So you can see that, it's not like black or white. It's not you're only doing one or the other, but you can see that the balance is really key here. And early stage programs, which we see this all the time with people we talk to in the industry. Why are you going down this path of trying to do automation, infrastructure automation in the first place? Well, a lot of the times you're feeling pressure. How do we deploy faster? The application teams, the development teams need to get infrastructure. They don't want to have to worry about the infrastructure. They just want it there. So how do you actually, that's the initial focus. But as you get more and more mature, and for organizations where the applications are more and more business critical, there's also, how do I actually balance that speed? I need to bring in all the controls, we've talked about a little, the security of the infrastructure I'm deploying, the security of the code that I'm deploying, the cost analysis and the predictability of cost. So all of those things come in, but it's really interesting to see this clear dichotomy between leaders and early stage programs. And to outcomes, it's really important to, I think, to look at the benefit of mastering this speed control paradox, because if you can, and when leaders do this, they're 2 times more likely to get their deployments right on the first try. They're 4 times more likely to provision new resources in under 4 hours. And they're 5 times more likely to be able to deploy changes multiple times, in production daily or multiple times a day. So they're able to not only have more predictability in terms of reliability, and they get it right, but they're also able to deploy 4 times faster, and they're able to adapt 5 times faster. So the benefit to the business and to the organization of mastering this balance is really key. Great. So now that we've kind of explained a little the speed control paradox and gone through the ideas of why it's so important to master, I wanted to talk a little about, where do leaders excel? What are they doing that we were able to isolate that really differentiates them? So there's a couple of key points. One is leaders automate all their infrastructure pipelines. So when it comes to day 1 and day 2 operations, it's really key to not only focus on accelerating how fast I can deploy infrastructure, but the long-term, day 2 management of configuration management, long-term changes to those resources of involved in my infrastructure. Do I have those both managed and centralized in a common process? That's a big differentiator for leaders versus the overall population. I think it's important also here to look, especially in a hybrid world, right? When you're more cloud native and cloud only, the balance between day 1 and day 2, it's more heavily slanted towards day 1. There's a lot of deployment, less long-term management, because people will spin down and spin up when they need to change. On premises, you tend to see less, you deploy once, but you're managing a much longer time. So depending on what your environment is like, and we're seeing more and more hybrid, of course, so the ability to manage both of these in a uniform way across your hybrid environment is becoming more important. Leaders also commit to platform engineering. So leaders are 5 times more likely to have implemented a platform team. And whether you call it a platform team by label or just the idea of having centralized processes and a team that's really managing and owning, I think ownership is a key piece here. So the ability to have your processes centralized, ownership centralized, and your processes standardized, right? So if you have the benefit of being able to have that in your platform team, so then you can continue to innovate even on the DevOps side, but you're able to, that's a big advantage that a lot of leaders that really stood out. And then security. If you look at the leaders in our report, 93% versus 14 with experimenters, which is, pretty stark difference. But leaders integrate security into their infrastructure automation, whether that's looking at security of policies and who has access to deploy what. If you're looking at scanning of their infrastructure, or their infrastructure is their code, right? The security focus really came screamingly through that leaders integrate security into their infrastructure automation. So those are just a few highlights, but there was really 5 key things that separated leaders in our research. So one is implementing developer self-service. So the ability to, as you standardize and build these really good pipeline processes, the ability for developers to come and request their own infrastructure, not having to know about anything underneath, but they get served good standardized infrastructure quickly, that's secure, that's cost efficient, all those different parameters, but that was a big piece. We talked about this a little, but security and compliance, putting it early in your automation strategy and early in your pipeline when you're actually going through your deployment and management is really key. Platform team approach. And there's 2 other ones I think that are important here as well, but prioritizing cost optimization. So we didn't dig into this as much in here, but the research shows the leaders are the ones who also look at the cost side of their infrastructure when they're putting in controls. So, make sure that what people want to deploy, that I can project and understand what the cost of that infrastructure will be, and that it meets the criteria of my my budget and my finance team. So that's a really important piece to bring into your infrastructure automation. And then we talked a little about this too, but avoiding siloed automation, making sure your day 1 and day 2 operations are managed in a seamless process, clear controls, and clear understanding of ownership. So those were the 5 key things that really separated leaders when you break it down into concrete, demonstrable, processes, behaviors, and outcomes. Great. So if that kind of gives you an idea of what leaders do that's different, the current state that we saw in the infrastructure automation market, we then wanted to talk about that measurable framework for progress. So how can you understand where you are and what key things need to be done to help you progress, from into later stages of the Infrastructure Automation Leadership Index. So when we looked at all the questions we had in the report, and we did a lot of different, we ran several models to determine what are the best questions to really isolate and identify and categorize different programs and teams in terms of where they are. And so it came down to these 5 questions, and these questions are, of course, not just yes, no. There's a couple underneath, but these are the key questions. What percentage of your infrastructure is managed by infrastructure as code, right? What infrastructure processes are currently automated at your organization? And this covers day 1, day 2, security, policy, enforcement, not just the deployment part, it's actually all the pieces around it. How broad is your infrastructure automation, and what parts of your pipeline does it touch? And then number 3, what strategies does your organization use to handle drift? And this is a key one because we all know drift is inevitable. It's needed sometimes. There's oftentimes you need to make changes to your infrastructure outside of your infrastructure automation, blessed processes. But sometimes you don't want that happening. So how do you handle that? Is it automated? Is it manual? Does that understand the business impact? And not just detection, what about actual remediation? Are you automating remediation? Do you want to automate remediation? So those strategies and understanding what you're doing for drift detection and remediation is also a key part of understanding where you are. And then number 4 is really around the collaboration. One of the things that's really key is collaboration between your DevOps team, your platform team, development, and your security teams. They all need to be aligned in understanding what infrastructure is deployed and being able to communicate about it and what current state of infrastructure is. So how well is your infrastructure automation program helping to foster that relationship? And then finally, where are you in terms of considering a shift to platform engineering? These were the real key questions that we built into a self-assessment. And so you can actually, if you're interested, we will send this out later as well. But if you're interested, you could scan this QR code, take the self-assessment. It's those simple 5 questions with some detail underneath, but it gives you a score and then puts you into one of these buckets to clearly help you understand where you are. Further, once you've done that evaluation, we will then send you to a set of curated best practices, training materials, content from our blog. In a Spacelift blog, we get about 1 million visitors a month. So there's a lot of content in there that people really find valuable. So whether you're an experimenter, an adopter, an optimizer, or a leader, you will get a curated set. We call them mission guides, but you're going to get a curated set of content that really helps you progress to that next stage. And of course, if you want to read the report, we will send it out as a follow-up, but you can scan this QR code and get the report as well. So that hopefully gives you a good idea of the speed control paradox, some of the findings we have from this report, and what separates leaders from others in terms of mastering that speed control paradox. And I'd like to run a quick poll at the end here. So it's poll time. Okay, so let's start the poll. And as you can imagine, the poll is definitely about speed versus control. And so it'd be great to understand, what's your top priority right now with IAC? Is it speed or control? And so we'll give this a little while for people to vote, and then we'll go into Q&A. All right, still going. So you can see it's interesting. A lot of control on here, which is very interesting. So thank you for that. I'll close out the poll now, or I'll stop sharing it. I'll leave it up if you want to vote. But now we'll go to Q&A. There's a few questions. Average time to complete. So let me share this question. The average time to complete these self-assessment, it's really pretty fast. It takes on average, I'd say less than 5 minutes. So 5 to 10 minutes at most. And we've had a lot of people start to do it, both actually customers benchmarking where they are, and also, people engaged in the industry. We've seen a lot of people use it in terms of trying to understand where they are. So it's meant to be a lightweight way to find out where you are and get some good detail and then move forward. Okay, stop sharing that one. Bring up this next one. What does dev self-service look like? Is it a centralized request process, or having engineers on the teams learn enough Terraform to provision what they need in their accounts? So, I think this somewhat depends on where you are in your stage. So we certainly see a number of teams where developers are doing their own Terraform in the beginning. And I think, but when you really talk about self-service, it's really about moving away from that model. So where developers can come, and there's usually a portal, and they can choose, there's standardized ways of saying, I want to deploy, for instance, this type of database or this kind of particular infrastructure for my app. They fill out certain pieces that are parameterized for them. They don't need to know Terraform. They just need to know, it's really in the developer's language of what infrastructure they need. They come in, click go, and boom, it's deployed for them. So it's really moving away from developers needing to know Terraform. That's the whole point of developer self-service. Okay. Sorry, these are coming in fast and furious. Let me just. I'm an engineer. How to talk? Let me share this. I'm an engineer. How to talk to stakeholders, think manager, to encourage them that it's worth pay money to use third-party IaC orchestration tools? Yeah, good question. So I think there's 2 parts to this really. we see a lot of people in their first phase of starting to centralize, whether you're, an optimizer, where we're starting to see people use a traditional CI/CD tooling to try to manage infrastructure, IaC code, whether it's OpenTofu, Terraform, what have you. And what we see is that works to a certain extent, but then you end up putting so much effort into maintaining software, your CI/CD tool that's really meant for more software deployment than it is stateful infrastructure, that the amount of energy you're putting into maintaining your CI/CD tool is a huge amount of overhead compared to using a specialized tool, an orchestrator, to really do that. So that's really where we see a lot of, one of the big places people start to realize the value of paying for a third-party IaC orchestration tool. The other is that whole control piece. How are you going to have control over who has access to your infrastructure, who can make changes, drift detection? Those are really the parts that come in that, as people are trying to really scale their IaC operations, that IaC orchestration tools come into play. Okay, let's see. I'm sorry, I'm looking through these questions. I'll share this one. Oh, here, sorry, this one. How do teams manage day one and day two operations effectively? So I think there's a couple of pieces here. One is linking these together. So we see a lot of organizations where you walk in and there's highly siloed ways of looking at your day. Typically, we're talking about Terraform when it comes to day two operations. So there's a lot of Terraform automation that's been built out, and yet it's very siloed and separated from, say, your Terraform type of operations. And when we really talk about how do you manage day one and day two effectively, it's being able to link these together, share context and information between these two. So you want to fully automate, you're deploying something with Terraform, you then are able to pass that information, the context of what's been deployed, seamlessly over to your Ansible infrastructure, your playbooks. So then your playbooks can come in and configure those, do config management on them, later on do continual updates if you need to push new images or security settings to those deployed resources. You can do that, via your playbooks, but you can see that all in one inventory. And so it's not just about deploying it day one and then doing your, early configuration management. It's about long term. Same as you have drift when it comes to your state files for IaC. There's drift when it comes to day two operations. How do you know which the playbooks you ran, are they running effectively on the resources that you asked them to be run on? Are you seeing any deviations from what you thought was going to be set to what was set? So that's really what we mean about managing day two and day one operations seamlessly in an integrated workflow. Okay. Oh, here's some more. Does sticking to Terraform post fork mean you were confined to Terraform Cloud platform? No. I.e., does using any other force us to migrate to OpenTofu? No, there are certainly ways that you can adopt newer versions of Terraform with orchestration platforms, for sure. There's ways you can bring your own binary to run your actual Terraform code. So there's definitely ways around that. You are not limited just to post fork Terraform. I'm sorry, you're not limited to Terraform pre-fork, for sure. Okay, well, that brings us up on time. And we have 40 seconds left. And let me just share this last question. Engineers historically don't know what resources their stack requires and ask for the moon. What best practices can you employ to minimize infrastructure costs when giving self-service to engineers? So I think it's a critical point. I'll try to go quickly before I run out of time. But this is the whole reason to having policies, practices, and the ability to have self-service really not give the moves. That's really what's important in terms of what you offer to your engineers from a self-service perspective.